The wind howled through the mountain pass as Francis James stood frozen in terror, watching the three men advance toward her with predatory grins. Her heart hammered against her ribs as their leader, a scarred man with cold eyes, reached out to grab her arm. "Well, well, what do we have here?" he sneered, his breath reeking of whiskey and tobacco. "A woman all alone in these mountains. How convenient." Frances tried to back away, but her legs felt like water. At 42, she had thought her days of fearing such men were behind her. She had been wrong. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind. "I have nothing of value." The men laughed, a sound that made her skin crawl. "Oh, but you do, darling. You certainly do." Just as the leader's fingers brushed her sleeve, a voice cut through the mountain air like a blade of ice. "That's my wife." The words were spoken quietly, almost conversationally, but they carried a weight that made all three men freeze. Francis turned to see a tall figure emerging from the shadows of the pine trees, his rifle held with casual confidence. Benjamin Scott stepped into the clearing, his weathered face calm but his gray eyes burning with a fury that made the mountain wind seem warm by comparison. He was a man carved from the wilderness itself, broad-shouldered and steady, with hands that had known both gentleness and violence. "Your wife?" The scarred man laughed nervously, but his hand had already moved away from Francis. "We didn't know, mister. She was just wandering around alone." "She's not alone," Benjamin said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man who had never needed to raise it to be obeyed. "She's never alone. Not anymore." The three men exchanged glances, suddenly aware that they were no longer the predators in this scenario. Something in Benjamin's stance, in the way he held himself, spoke of a man who had faced down bears and survived blizzards that would kill lesser men. "Now you boys are going to walk away," Benjamin continued, stepping closer to Francis without taking his eyes off the men. "You're going to walk away, and you're going to keep walking until you're off my mountain." "Your mountain?" The leader tried to bluster, but his voice cracked slightly. Benjamin's smile was thin and cold as winter morning. "Every tree, every rock, every breath of wind. Mine. And she's mine too. So unless you want to find out what happens to men who threaten what belongs to me, I suggest you start moving." The scarred man looked at his companions, then at Benjamin's rifle, then at the unwavering certainty in the mountain man's eyes. Whatever he saw there made his decision for him. "Come on, boy," he muttered, backing away. Plenty of other trails to explore. They melted back into the forest like shadows, leaving only the sound of the wind and Francis's ragged breathing. She stood there trembling, hardly able to believe what had just happened. Benjamin lowered his rifle and turned to her, his expression softening. "Are you hurt?" Francis shook her head, unable to find her voice. This man, this stranger, had just claimed her as his wife to protect her from those predators. But how had she come to be here, alone on a mountain, depending on the kindness of a man she barely knew? The story had begun 3 months earlier, in the dusty streets of Cedar Falls, where Frances James had learned the hardest lesson of her life, that a woman of 42, with silver threading through her brown hair and lines marking her face, was considered worthless by most of society. Frances had been married to Thomas James for 18 years, when he decided she was too old for his tastes. At 38, he had taken up with a girl barely 20, leaving Frances with nothing but a small bag of belongings and the clothes on her back. The house, the business, even the furniture they had bought together, all of it belonged to him by law. "You're past your prime, Frances," Thomas had told her with casual cruelty as she packed her meager possessions. "Margaret is young, fertile. She can give me the sons I need to carry on the business." Frances had wanted to remind him that she had tried for years to give him children, had suffered through 3 miscarriages that had nearly broken her spirit. But what was the point? In Thomas's eyes, her failure to produce an heir was just another mark against her advancing age. The people of Cedar Falls had watched her downfall with a mixture of pity and satisfaction. Some whispered that she should have seen it coming, should have worked harder to keep her husband's interest. Others simply avoided her altogether, as if her misfortune might be contagious. Mrs. Eleanor Patterson, the banker's wife and unofficial queen of Cedar Falls society, had made her position clear when Frances approached her about work. "My dear Frances," she had said with false sympathy, I'm afraid there's simply nothing suitable for a woman of your circumstances. Perhaps you should consider moving somewhere where people don't know your situation. The message was clear. Cedar Falls had no place for a discarded wife, especially one who reminded other women of their own vulnerability. Frances had tried everything. She offered to clean houses, to take in washing, to work in the general store. But Cedar Falls was a small town, and Thomas James carried influence. Doors that might have opened for a younger woman, or even for a widow, remained firmly closed to a divorced woman in her 40s. The final humiliation came when she applied to work at the boarding house run by Mrs. Hutchins, a stern woman who had known Frances since childhood. "I'm sorry, Frances," Mrs. Hutchins had said, not meeting her eyes, "but I can't have a woman of questionable morals working here. It would reflect poorly on the establishment." Questionable morals. Frances had been faithful to her husband for 18 years, had run his household with efficiency and grace, had been a pillar of the community. But none of that mattered now. She was a divorced woman, and in the eyes of Cedar Falls, that made her little better than a prostitute. With her small savings dwindling and no prospects in sight, Frances had made the desperate decision to answer an advertisement in the territorial newspaper. A man in the mountain territory was seeking a housekeeper, someone to help maintain his remote cabin through the harsh winter months. The pay was modest but included room and board, and most importantly, it was far from Cedar Falls and the judgmental eyes of people who had once called her friend. The journey to the mountains had been grueling. The stagecoach had taken her as far as Millbrook, a rough frontier town that served as the last outpost before the true wilderness began. From there, she had hired a guide to take her up the mountain trails to the cabin belonging to one Benjamin Scott. The guide, a grizzled man named Roy Adams, who smelled of tobacco and unwashed wool, had been skeptical from the start. "You sure about this, ma'am?" he had asked as they loaded her few belongings onto his pack mule. "That Scott fellow, he's been alone up there for nigh on 5 years. Might not take kindly to having a woman around, especially one who's—" He had trailed off, but Frances knew what he meant to say. "Especially one who's old." "I'm sure," Frances had replied, though her stomach churned with anxiety. "Mr. Scott specifically requested a mature woman for the position. Someone reliable and experienced in housekeeping." Roy had shrugged and spat into the dust. "Your funeral, lady, but I'm telling you now, if he sends you packing, I ain't making another trip up that mountain until spring. You'd be stuck up there until the snows melt." The threat had hung over Frances like a storm cloud as they made their way up the winding mountain pass. What if Benjamin Scott took one look at her weathered face and graying hair and decided she wouldn't do? What if he was expecting someone younger, someone who could provide more than just housekeeping services? The higher they climbed, the more her doubts multiplied. The air grew thin and cold, and the trees pressed close around the narrow trail like disapproving sentinels. This was no place for a woman who had spent her entire life in the comfortable civilization of Cedar Falls. "There she is," Roy had said as they crested a ridge and looked down into a small valley. Scott's place. Frances had felt her heart sink. The cabin was smaller than she had imagined, a rough-hewn structure of logs and stone that looked barely large enough for one person, let alone two. Smoke rose from the chimney, and she could see a small garden plot beside the building, but otherwise, the valley was empty of any signs of civilization. This was to be her new home. This isolated cabin, miles from the nearest neighbor, surrounded by wilderness that could kill the unprepared without mercy. Roy had helped her down from the mule and shouldered her bag. "Come on, then. Let's get this over with." They had approached the cabin slowly, their footsteps crunching on the fallen leaves that carpeted the valley floor. Before they could knock, the door opened, and Frances got her first look at Benjamin Scott. He was not what she had expected. Where she had pictured a rough, unkempt hermit, she found instead a man who carried himself with quiet dignity. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair touched by silver at the temples and gray eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. His clothes were simple but clean, his cabin well-maintained despite its rustic appearance. "Mr. Scott?" Frances had managed, her voice smaller than she intended. "You must be Mrs. James," he had replied, his voice deep and calm. "I got your letter." He studied her for a long moment, and Frances felt herself being weighed and measured. She lifted her chin, trying to project confidence she didn't feel. This was her last chance, her only option. If Benjamin Scott rejected her, she had nowhere else to go. "I know I'm not what you might have expected," she said, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "I'm older than most women who would apply for such a position, but I assure you I'm capable and hardworking. I can cook, clean, mend clothes, tend a garden. I won't be any trouble, Mr. Scott. I just need a chance." Something in his expression softened slightly. "Age doesn't concern me, Mrs. James. I'm looking for someone reliable, someone who can handle the isolation and the work. Can you do that?" Frances nodded eagerly. "Yes, sir, I can." Benjamin had turned to Roy. "Thank you for bringing her up safely. There's coffee on the stove if you want some before you head back down." Roy had accepted the coffee gratefully and spent an hour warming himself by the fire while Benjamin showed Frances around the cabin. It was small but efficiently designed, with a main room that served as kitchen and living area, a smaller bedroom, and a loft space where Benjamin said she could sleep. "I spend most of my time outdoors," he explained as they toured the modest space. "Hunting, trapping, checking the snares. The cabin's mainly for sleeping and getting out of the weather. Your job would be to keep it clean, cook the meals, preserve meat and vegetables for winter. Think you can handle that?" "Absolutely," Frances had replied, relief flooding through her. He wasn't sending her away. He was actually considering hiring her. "Winter's coming fast up here," Benjamin continued. "Once the heavy snows start, we'll be cut off from the outside world until spring. No visitors, no supplies, no way to leave even if you wanted to. Some people can't handle that kind of isolation. It drives them a little crazy." Frances thought of the isolation she had already experienced in Cedar Falls, surrounded by people who treated her like she was invisible. "I think I can manage, Mr. Scott." He had studied her again with those penetrating gray eyes. "Why are you here, Mrs. James? A woman doesn't come to the mountains alone unless she's running from something." The question had caught her off guard, and for a moment she considered lying, making up some story about adventure or a love of nature. But something in Benjamin's manner suggested he would see through any deception. "My husband divorced me," she said quietly, "for a younger woman. I couldn't find work in town afterward. People think I'm too old to be useful anymore." Benjamin's jaw had tightened slightly. "Their loss," he said simply. Those two words, spoken with quiet conviction, had meant more to Frances than all the sympathy and false comfort she had received from others. He didn't pity her or judge her. He simply accepted her situation and moved on. "The job pays $20 a month plus room and board," he said. "Is that acceptable?" It was more than Frances had dared hope for. "Very acceptable, Mr. Scott. Thank you." "Benjamin," he corrected. "If we're going to be sharing a cabin all winter, we might as well use first names." "Frances," she replied, offering a tentative smile. Roy had finished his coffee and prepared to leave, loading his pack mule and checking his gear. "You sure about this, ma'am?" he asked Frances one last time. "Last chance to change your mind." Frances looked around the valley, at the towering peaks that surrounded it like protective walls, at the cabin that would be her home, at Benjamin Scott, who had offered her a chance when no one else would. "I'm sure," she said. Roy shrugged and mounted his mule. "Suit yourself. See you in the spring, Scott." And then he was gone, disappearing up the trail that led back to civilization, leaving Frances alone with her new employer in the wilderness that would be her world for the next 6 months. The first few weeks had been an adjustment for both of them. Frances threw herself into her work with determined efficiency, cleaning the cabin from top to bottom, organizing Benjamin's sparse possessions, and learning to cook on the wood-burning stove that heated the main room. Benjamin was a man of few words, but Frances gradually learned to read his moods and preferences. He rose before dawn and often didn't return until after sunset, his days filled with the countless tasks required to survive in the wilderness. He checked trap lines, hunted for fresh meat, chopped wood, and prepared for the harsh winter that was approaching. Frances found herself fascinated by his competence, the way he moved through the forest like he was part of it. He could track animals by signs she couldn't even see, predict weather changes by subtle shifts in the wind, and find his way through miles of seemingly identical wilderness without ever getting lost. "How long have you lived up here?" she asked one evening as they shared a simple dinner of venison stew and cornbread. "5 years," Benjamin replied, not looking up from his plate. "Came up after the war." Frances waited for him to elaborate, but he didn't. She had learned that Benjamin Scott was not a man who shared his thoughts easily. Whatever had driven him to seek solitude in the mountains, it was not something he discussed with casual acquaintances. But gradually, as the days shortened and the first snows began to dust the peaks, Frances began to see glimpses of the man beneath the stoic exterior. He was unfailingly courteous to her, never raising his voice or showing impatience, even when she made mistakes. When she struggled with the heavy water buckets, he quietly moved them for her without being asked. When she mentioned missing the herb garden she had tended in Cedar Falls, he helped her identify wild plants that could serve similar purposes. Most surprisingly, he seemed genuinely interested in her opinions and observations. When she suggested a more efficient way to organize the food stores, he listened carefully and implemented her ideas. When she pointed out that certain repairs to the cabin would make it more comfortable for winter, he made those improvements without complaint. It was a respect Frances hadn't experienced in years, perhaps ever. Thomas had always treated her contributions to their household as expected duties rather than valuable skills. Benjamin, by contrast, seemed to appreciate her competence and experience. The first real test of their partnership came when an early blizzard struck in late October, trapping them in the cabin for 3 days. Frances had worried that the forced confinement would strain their still-developing relationship, but instead it seemed to strengthen it. Benjamin proved to be surprisingly good company when he chose to talk. He had traveled extensively before settling in the mountains, and he entertained Frances with stories of his adventures in California during the gold rush, his time as a soldier in the war, and his encounters with various colorful characters along the frontier. "You've lived quite a life," Frances said as they sat by the fire on the second evening of the storm, the wind howling outside like a living thing. Benjamin shrugged. "Just trying to find a place where I fit, I suppose." "And do you? Fit here, I mean." He was quiet for a long moment, staring into the flames. "I thought I did. These past 5 years, I convinced myself that solitude was what I needed. But having you here," he trailed off, seeming to catch himself before saying too much. "Having me here what?" Frances prompted gently. Benjamin looked at her then, his gray eyes reflecting the firelight. "Having you here has reminded me what I've been missing. Conversation, shared meals, someone to care whether I come home at night." The admission hung between them like a bridge neither was quite ready to cross. Frances felt her heart flutter in a way it hadn't in years, but she pushed the feeling down. She was here as an employee, nothing more. A woman of her age had no business entertaining romantic notions about her employer, but as the winter deepened and the snows piled higher around the cabin, it became increasingly difficult to maintain the pretense that their relationship was purely professional. They were two people thrown together by circumstance, dependent on each other for survival and companionship, and gradually, inevitably, they began to care for each other. It started with small gestures. Benjamin would bring Frances wildflowers when he found them blooming in sheltered spots. Frances would prepare his favorite meals without being asked, and mend his clothes with extra care. They began to linger over their evening meals, talking about everything and nothing, reluctant to end the companionable moments. One evening in December, as they sat by the fire working on their respective tasks, Frances mending socks while Benjamin carved a new handle for a broken tool, she found herself studying his profile in the flickering light. "Benjamin," she said softly, why did you really come to the mountains? You said it was after the war, but there must have been more to it than that." His hand stilled on the carving, and for a moment Frances thought he wouldn't answer. When he did speak, his voice was quiet and distant. "I had a wife once, Sarah. We were married just before I enlisted. She promised to wait for me, and I believed her." He set down his carving and stared into the fire. "When I came back, I found out she'd married my brother while I was gone. They said I was dead, that the army had told them so. Maybe they really believed it, or maybe it was just convenient." Frances felt her heart ache for him. I'm sorry, Benjamin. That must have been devastating. I was angry at first, wanted to fight my brother, make them both pay for what they'd done to me. But then I realized that Sarah had made her choice. She'd chosen security over waiting for a man who might never come home. I couldn't really blame her for that. So you came here? So I came here, he confirmed. Figured if I was going to be alone, I might as well be alone somewhere beautiful. Frances set down her mending and reached out to touch his hand. You're not alone now. Benjamin looked down at their joined hands, then up at her face. No, he said softly. I'm not. The moment stretched between them, full of unspoken possibilities. Frances felt herself leaning toward him, drawn by the warmth in his eyes and the gentleness in his touch. But then reality crashed back over her like cold water. She was 42 years old with silver in her hair and lines on her face. She was a divorced woman with no prospects and no future beyond this temporary employment. What could a man like Benjamin Scott possibly want with someone like her? She pulled her hand back and picked up her mending, trying to ignore the hurt that flashed across Benjamin's features. It's getting late, she said, her voice artificially bright. I should finish these socks and get some sleep. Benjamin nodded slowly, understanding the rejection even if he didn't understand the reason for it. Of course. Good night, Frances. Good night, Benjamin. But sleep was a long time coming for both of them that night. The awkwardness from that evening lingered for several days, with both of them being overly polite and careful around each other. Frances threw herself into her work with renewed vigor, as if staying busy could somehow quiet the longing that had awakened in her heart. Benjamin, for his part, spent even more time outside the cabin, returning only for meals and sleep. When he did speak to Frances, it was with the same courteous distance he had maintained when she first arrived. Frances told herself this was for the best. She was here to work, not to complicate Benjamin's life with her inappropriate feelings. A man like him deserves someone young and beautiful, someone who could give him children and grow old beside him without embarrassing him with her faded looks. But the heart, Frances was learning, rarely listened to reason. The breaking point came during a fierce January storm that lasted nearly a week. The wind was so strong it threatened to tear the roof off the cabin, and the snow fell so heavily that Benjamin couldn't venture outside even to check on the animals in the small shelter he had built. Confined together in the close quarters, with nothing to do but wait out the storm, the tension between them became almost unbearable. They spoke only when necessary, moving around each other with careful precision, both of them acutely aware of every glance, every accidental touch. On the fourth day of the storm, Frances was preparing dinner when she accidentally knocked over a pot of stew, sending the precious food spilling across the floor. It was a simple accident, the kind of thing that happened to everyone, but in her emotionally fraught state, it felt like the final straw. She sank to her knees beside the mess and began to cry, great heaving sobs that shook her entire body. All the pain and rejection of the past year, all the loneliness and fear and desperate hope came pouring out in a torrent of tears. I'm sorry, she gasped, trying to clean up the spilled stew with shaking hands. I'm so sorry, Benjamin. I've ruined everything. I'm useless, just like Thomas said. Too old, too clumsy, too worthless to keep around. Strong hands gently pulled her to her feet, and suddenly she was in Benjamin's arms, her face pressed against his chest while he stroked her hair and murmured soothing words. Shh, he whispered. It's all right, Frances. It's just food. We have plenty more. No, it's not all right, she sobbed. Nothing's all right. I don't belong here. I don't belong anywhere. I'm just a burden, a useless old woman who can't even keep a pot of stew from spilling. Benjamin pulled back slightly and cupped her face in his hands, forcing her to meet his eyes. Listen to me, Frances James, he said firmly. You are not useless. You are not too old. You are not a burden. You are a strong, capable, beautiful woman who has been treated badly by people who didn't deserve you. Beautiful? Frances laughed bitterly through her tears. Benjamin, look at me. Really look at me. I'm 42 years old. My hair is turning gray. My face is lined. My body is not what it once was. I'm past my prime, past any hope of being wanted or desired. Benjamin's thumbs brushed away her tears as he studied her face with an intensity that made her breath catch. "You want to know what I see when I look at you?" he asked softly. Francis nodded, unable to speak. "I see a woman who has survived heartbreak and betrayal and come through it with her dignity intact. I see someone who works harder than anyone has a right to ask, who never complains about the isolation or the hardships. I see eyes that are kind and wise, hands that are gentle and skilled, a spirit that refuses to be broken no matter what life throws at it." His voice dropped to a whisper. "I see the most beautiful woman I've ever known, and I've been falling in love with her a little more each day since she arrived on my mountain." Francis stared at him in shock, hardly able to believe what she was hearing. "Benjamin, you can't mean that. You're just being kind because I'm upset." "I've never been more serious about anything in my life," he replied. "I love you, Francis, not despite your age, but because of everything you are. Your strength, your grace, your wisdom, your compassion. You've brought light into a life I thought would always be lived in shadow." "But I'm too old to give you children," Francis protested weakly. "I'm too old for so many things." "Do you think I care about that?" Benjamin asked. "Francis, I'm 38 years old. I've had my chance at youth and passion and all the things people think matter. What I want now is partnership, companionship, someone to share my life with, not just my bed." He leaned his forehead against hers, his voice rough with emotion. "I want you, Francis. All of you. Your laugh, your tears, your stories, your dreams. I want to wake up beside you every morning and fall asleep with you in my arms every night. I want to grow old with you, to face whatever comes our way together." Francis felt her resolve crumbling like a dam in a flood. "Benjamin, marry me," he said suddenly, the words tumbling out like he'd been holding them back for months. "Stay with me, not as my housekeeper, but as my wife. Let me love you the way you deserve to be loved." Frances pulled back to stare at him, her heart hammering so hard she was sure he could hear it. "You want to marry me? Really?" "More than I've ever wanted anything," Benjamin said solemnly. "I know it's sudden, and I know you might need time to think about it. But Frances, these months with you have been the happiest of my life. I don't want to go back to being alone." Frances thought of her old life in Cedar Falls, of the people who had dismissed her as worthless, of Thomas who had thrown her away like a broken tool. Then she looked at Benjamin, this good, strong man who saw value in her when no one else would, who offered her not just security, but genuine love and respect. "Yes," she whispered, hardly believing her own boldness. "Yes, Benjamin, I'll marry you." The kiss that followed was gentle and sweet, full of promise and hope. When they finally broke apart, both of them were crying, but these were tears of joy rather than sorrow. "I love you too," Frances said, the words feeling strange and wonderful on her tongue. "I think I have for weeks now, but I was too afraid to admit it, even to myself." "Never be afraid with me," Benjamin said, holding her close. "Never again." They were married 3 days later, when the storm finally broke, and the sun emerged to shine on a world transformed by snow. There was no minister, no witnesses except the mountains themselves, but they spoke their vows to each other with a solemnity that made the words more binding than any legal document. "I, Benjamin Scott, take you, Frances James, to be my wife," he said, holding both her hands in his as they stood in the clearing before their cabin. "I promise to love you, to honor you, to stand beside you through whatever comes. I promise to see you as you truly are, a woman of strength and beauty and worth. I, Frances James, take you, Benjamin Scott, to be my husband," she replied, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her cheeks. "I promise to love you, to support you, to build a life with you in this place we both call home. I promise to trust in your love and to never doubt my own worth again." They sealed their vows with a kiss that tasted of new beginnings and second chances. The winter that followed was the happiest time of Frances's life. She and Benjamin settled into married life with an ease that surprised them both. They were well-matched partners, complementing each other's strengths and supporting each other through challenges. Benjamin taught Frances to read the signs of the wilderness, how to predict weather changes, how to identify animal tracks, how to find her way through the forest. Frances shared her knowledge of herbs and healing, her skills at preserving food and managing resources. More importantly, they learned to share their thoughts and dreams, their fears and hopes. Benjamin told Frances about his childhood on a farm in Ohio, about the horrors he had witnessed during the war, about his dreams of building something lasting in the mountains. Frances spoke of her marriage to Thomas, of the miscarriages that had broken her heart, of her terror when she realized she had nowhere to turn. "I used to think my life was over," Frances said one evening as they lay in bed, listening to the wind whistle through the pines. "I thought being divorced at my age meant I would spend the rest of my days alone and unwanted." "And now?" Benjamin asked, his arm tightening around her. "Now I think maybe my real life is just beginning," Frances replied. "Maybe everything that happened before was just preparing me for this, for you, for the happiness I never thought I deserved." Benjamin kissed the top of her head. "You deserve everything good this world has to offer, Frances Scott, and I'm going to spend the rest of my life making sure you know it." Spring came late that year, but when it finally arrived, it brought with it a sense of renewal and possibility. Frances worked beside Benjamin to plant a larger garden, to repair winter damage to the cabin, to prepare for another year in their mountain paradise. She had never been happier, never felt more valued or loved. Benjamin treated her like a precious gift, never taking her presence for granted, always making sure she knew how much she meant to him. But their happiness was not destined to go unchallenged. In late May, as Frances was working in the garden while Benjamin checked his trap lines, she heard the sound of horses approaching. She straightened, shading her eyes against the sun, and saw 3 riders coming down the trail into their valley. Her blood ran cold as she recognized the lead rider. It was Jeremy Kelly, one of Thomas's business associates from Cedar Falls, a man she had never liked or trusted. The 2 men with him were strangers, but something in their manner set her nerves on edge. Well, Jeremy called out as they rode up to the cabin, "if it isn't Frances James, though I hear you go by a different name now." Frances wiped her hands on her apron, trying to project calm confidence. "Mr. Kelly, what brings you to the mountains?" Jeremy dismounted, his companions following suit. "Business, Frances, always business. Though I have to say, I'm surprised to find you living in such primitive conditions. This is quite a step down from the life you had with Thomas." "I'm perfectly content with my life," Frances replied coolly. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have work to do." "Oh, but we've come such a long way to see you," Jeremy said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Surely you can spare a few minutes for old friends?" "We were never friends, Mr. Kelly." Jeremy's smile faded. "No, I suppose we weren't, but that doesn't mean we can't do business together." Frances felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. "What kind of business?" "The kind that could make us all very rich," Jeremy replied. "You see, Frances, I've discovered something very interesting about this little valley of yours, something that could change everything." Before Frances could ask what he meant, she heard the sound of approaching footsteps. Benjamin emerged from the tree line, his rifle in his hands and his face set in grim lines. He had obviously seen the horses and come running. "Frances," he called out, not taking his eyes off the 3 men. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine, Benjamin," she replied, relief flooding through her at his presence. Jeremy looked between them with interest. "So this is the famous mountain man, Benjamin Scott, isn't it? I've heard quite a bit about you." Benjamin ignored the introduction, moving to stand beside Frances. "What do you want?" "Just to talk business with your wife," Jeremy said smoothly. "You see, Mr. Scott, I represent certain interests that have become very interested in this valley, interested enough to make a very generous offer for the land." "The land's not for sale," Benjamin said flatly. "Oh, but I think it will be once you hear what I'm offering," Jeremy replied. "And once you understand what will happen if you refuse." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Frances felt Benjamin tense beside her, his grip tightening on his rifle. "Are you threatening us, Kelly?" Benjamin asked, his voice dangerously quiet. Jeremy held up his hands in mock innocence. "Not at all. I'm simply pointing out that accidents happen in the wilderness. People disappear. Sometimes they're never found." The 2 men with Jeremy shifted slightly, their hands moving closer to their weapons. Frances realized with growing horror that this was no simple business proposition. These men had come here with violence in mind. "What's so special about this valley?" Francis asked, trying to buy time while her mind raced for solutions. "It's just wilderness." Jeremy's eyes gleamed with avarice. "Not just wilderness, my dear Francis. This valley sits right on top of one of the richest silver veins anyone's ever seen. My associates have done extensive surveys. There's enough precious metal under your feet to make us all millionaires." "And you think you can just take it?" Benjamin asked. "Not take it," Jeremy corrected. "Buy it. For a very fair price, considering the circumstances. $500 for the entire valley. That's more money than most people see in a lifetime." Francis felt sick. $500 was a fortune to people like her and Benjamin, but she knew it was a fraction of what the land would be worth if Jeremy's claims were true. "And if we refuse?" Benjamin asked. Jeremy's smile turned cold. "Well, like I said, accidents happen, especially to people who don't have any legal claim to the land they're squatting on." Francis felt the blood drain from her face. "What do you mean, no legal claim?" "I mean, my dear Francis, that this land belongs to the territorial government. Your husband here has been living on it illegally for 5 years. All it would take is a word to the right officials, and you'd both be evicted. Of course, if something were to happen to you before the eviction notice arrived." He didn't need to finish the threat. Francis understood perfectly. These men intended to kill them and claim the land for themselves, using Benjamin's illegal status as cover for their crime. "You have until tomorrow morning to decide," Jeremy continued. "We'll be camped just up the trail. Think carefully about your answer, because it's the last decision you'll ever make." The 3 men mounted their horses and rode away, leaving Francis and Benjamin standing in the garden with their world crashing down around them. "Is it true," Francis asked quietly, "about the land not being legally yours?" Benjamin nodded grimly. "I never filed a proper claim. I just found this place and settled here. I figured I was too far from civilization for anyone to care." "So they could really have us evicted?" "If they wanted to do it legally, yes. But Francis, men like that don't usually bother with legal methods when violence is easier." Francis sank onto a nearby stump, her legs suddenly too weak to support her. "What are we going to do?" Benjamin knelt beside her, taking her hands in his. "We're going to fight. This is our home, Francis. Our life. I won't let them take it from us. But there are 3 of them, and they have guns." "So do I," Benjamin said grimly. "And I know this land better than they ever will. If they want to fight, they'll get one." Francis looked at her husband, this good man who had given her a second chance at happiness, and felt her heart break. "Benjamin, maybe we should just take the money and leave. Find somewhere else to start over." "Is that what you want?" he asked softly. Francis looked around the valley that had become her home, at the cabin they had shared through the long winter, at the garden where she had planted seeds for their future. "No," she whispered. "No, I don't want to leave, but I don't want to lose you either." "You won't lose me," Benjamin promised, pulling her into his arms. "We'll face this together, whatever comes." They spent the rest of the day preparing for the confrontation they knew was coming. Benjamin cleaned his weapons and checked his ammunition, while Francis gathered supplies and tried to think of ways they might escape if the worst happened. That night, they held each other close, both of them knowing it might be their last night together. They made love with a desperate passion, as if they could somehow hold back the dawn through the sheer force of their desire. "I love you, Francis Scott," Benjamin whispered as they lay entwined in the darkness. "Whatever happens tomorrow, I want you to know that these months with you have been the best of my life." "I love you too," Francis replied, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Thank you for showing me what it means to be truly wanted, truly valued." "You are wanted," Benjamin said fiercely. "You are precious and valuable and worth fighting for. Don't ever forget that." Dawn came too soon, bringing with it the sound of approaching horses. Francis and Benjamin rose and dressed quickly, then took their positions by the cabin's windows. Benjamin with his rifle and Francis with a smaller pistol he had taught her to use. Jeremy Kelly and his men rode into the clearing with casual confidence, clearly expecting an easy victory. They dismounted and approached the cabin, their weapons drawn but not yet raised. "Time's up, Scott," Jeremy called out. What's your answer? The answer is no, Benjamin replied through the window. This is our home, and we're not leaving. Jeremy sighed theatrically. I was hoping you'd be reasonable about this. But if you want to do this the hard way, he gestured to his men, who began to spread out, clearly intending to surround the cabin. Frances felt her heart hammering against her ribs as she watched them move into position. On my signal, Benjamin whispered to her, aim for the one on the left. Frances nodded, trying to steady her shaking hands. She had never shot at a human being before, but she would do whatever it took to protect the life she and Benjamin had built together. The attack came suddenly. Jeremy's men rushed the cabin from two sides while Jeremy himself provided covering fire from behind a large boulder. Benjamin's first shot took down one of the attackers, but the other made it to the cabin wall, where he began trying to break down the door. Frances fired through the window at Jeremy, missing him but forcing him to take cover. The sound of splintering wood told her that the man at the door was making progress. "The back window!" Benjamin shouted over the gunfire. "Go out the back window and get to the trees." "I'm not leaving you," Frances shouted back. "Frances, please." The door burst open, and the remaining attacker charged into the cabin. Benjamin spun to face him, but the man was already firing. Frances screamed as she saw Benjamin stagger, blood blooming across his shirt. Without thinking, Frances raised her pistol and fired. The bullet took the attacker in the chest, sending him crashing to the floor. She had never killed anyone before, but in that moment, all she felt was grim satisfaction. Benjamin was leaning against the wall, one hand pressed to his wounded shoulder. "I'm all right," he said, though his face was pale with pain. "It's not serious." Outside, Jeremy was still shooting, his bullets splintering the cabin walls. Frances helped Benjamin to a more protected position, then peered out the window to assess their situation. "There's just Jeremy left," she reported. "But he's got good cover behind that boulder." "We need to get him out in the open," Benjamin said through gritted teeth. "Can you keep him pinned down while I circle around?" "Benjamin, you're hurt. I can manage. Just give me covering fire." Frances nodded reluctantly and began shooting at Jeremy's position, forcing him to keep his head down. She watched as Benjamin slipped out the back of the cabin and began making his way through the trees, moving with the stealth of a man who had spent years in the wilderness. But Jeremy was cleverer than they had given him credit for. He must have seen Benjamin's movement, because suddenly he was no longer behind the boulder. Frances realized with horror that he was flanking Benjamin, moving to catch him in the open. She left her position at the window and ran outside, desperate to warn her husband. But she was too late. Jeremy emerged from behind a tree just as Benjamin stepped into a small clearing, and Frances watched in terror as the two men faced each other with raised weapons. "Drop the rifle, Scott," Jeremy commanded. "It's over." Benjamin's finger was on the trigger, but Frances could see that Jeremy had the advantage. He was unwounded, in better position, and had his gun already aimed at Benjamin's chest. "Let my wife go," Benjamin said quietly. "She has nothing to do with this." Jeremy laughed. "Your wife is the reason I'm here, you fool. Do you think this is really about silver? Frances James humiliated my business partner when she refused his generous offer to be his mistress after the divorce. Thomas wants her back, and he's willing to pay handsomely for her return." Frances felt sick. Thomas wanted her back, not out of love but out of wounded pride. He couldn't stand the idea that his discarded wife had found happiness without him. "She'll never go back to him," Benjamin said firmly. "She will if she wants to keep you alive," Jeremy replied. "Here's the new deal, Scott. Frances comes with me willingly, and you get to keep your pathetic little valley. Refuse, and I kill you both and tell the authorities you died resisting eviction." Frances felt the world spinning around her. After everything she had endured, after finally finding love and happiness, she was being forced to choose between her own freedom and Benjamin's life. But as she stood there in the mountain clearing, watching the man she loved face down a killer, Frances James Scott made a decision that surprised even her. She was not the same broken woman who had fled Cedar Falls in shame. She was not too old, too worthless, too weak to fight for what mattered to her. She was a mountain woman now, and mountain women protected their own. Moving as quietly as she could, Frances circled around behind Jeremy, her pistol raised and ready. She had one shot, and she couldn't afford to miss. "Jeremy Kelly," she called out, her voice steady and strong. Jeremy spun toward her, his gun swinging away from Benjamin. In that split second of distraction, Francis fired. The bullet caught Jeremy in the chest, spinning him around and sending him crashing to the ground. He tried to raise his weapon one last time, but Benjamin was already moving, kicking the gun away and standing over the fallen man. Jeremy looked up at them with hatred and disbelief. "You think this is over?" he gasped. "Thomas will send others. He'll never stop hunting you." "Let him come," Francis said, surprising herself with the steel in her voice. "This is my home now, and I'll defend it." Jeremy's eyes widened as he saw something in Francis that he had never noticed before, the strength of a woman who had finally learned her own worth. He died with that look of surprise still on his face. In the aftermath of the fight, Francis and Benjamin worked together to tend his wound and deal with the bodies. They buried the three men in unmarked graves at the edge of the valley, then spent the rest of the day reinforcing their defenses and planning for whatever might come next. "Do you think he was telling the truth about Thomas?" Francis asked that evening as they sat by the fire, Benjamin's arm in a sling but his eyes alert and watchful. "Probably," Benjamin replied. "Men like your ex-husband don't like to lose, especially to someone they consider beneath them." Francis was quiet for a long moment, thinking about the implications. "Maybe I should leave," she said finally. "Find somewhere else to go, somewhere Thomas can't find me. I won't let my problems put you in danger." Benjamin turned to face her, his expression fierce. "Francis Scott, you listen to me. You are not going anywhere. This is your home. I am your husband, and no one, not Thomas, not his hired guns, not the territorial government itself, is going to take you away from me." "But Benjamin—" "No buts," he said firmly. "We faced this together, just like we faced everything else. You're not the same woman who came up this mountain last fall, Francis. You're stronger now, braver. You found your fight, and I'll be damned if I let anyone take that away from you." Francis felt tears prick her eyes, but they were tears of gratitude rather than fear. "How did I get so lucky?" she whispered. "How did I find a man who sees me as I really am?" "The same way I got lucky enough to find a woman who makes me want to be better than I am," Benjamin replied, pulling her close with his good arm. "We found each other, Francis. Against all odds, in the middle of nowhere, we found each other." Over the following weeks, they heard nothing from Cedar Falls or from Thomas James. Francis began to hope that Jeremy's death had ended the threat, that Thomas had decided she wasn't worth the trouble of pursuing into the wilderness. But Benjamin remained vigilant, always watching the trails, always listening for the sound of approaching horses. He taught Francis more about survival in the mountains, about reading sign and moving silently through the forest. If more men came for them, they would be ready. Summer passed peacefully, with Francis and Benjamin working together to improve their home and prepare for another winter. Francis's garden flourished under her care, providing them with fresh vegetables and herbs. Benjamin's hunting and trapping brought in meat and fur, enough to see them through the cold months ahead. Most importantly, their marriage continued to deepen and strengthen. They were true partners now, united not just by love but by shared adversity and mutual respect. Francis had never imagined she could be so happy, so fulfilled, so completely valued for who she was. One evening in late August, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, Francis reflected on how much her life had changed. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked Benjamin. "Taking me on, I mean. Your life was so much simpler before I arrived." Benjamin considered the question seriously, as he did all her questions. "Simple, yes," he said finally, "but not better. Francis, before you came, I was just existing, just getting through each day. You gave me a reason to live again, a purpose beyond mere survival. Even with all the trouble I've brought?" "Especially because of the trouble," Benjamin said with a smile. "Fighting for something, for someone, makes a man remember what he's capable of. You've made me stronger, Francis, just as I hope I've made you stronger." Francis nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. The woman who had fled Cedar Falls in shame and desperation was gone, replaced by someone who could face down armed men to protect her home and her husband. "I love you, Benjamin Scott," she said, taking his hand in hers. "And I love you, Francis Scott," he replied. "My mountain woman, my partner, my wife." As if to test their resolve, trouble came again in early September. This time it wasn't hired guns, but a small group of territorial officials, led by a pompous man named Zachary Peterson, who claimed to represent the government's interests in the region. "Mr. Scott," Peterson announced as he and his three companions rode into the valley, "I'm here to inform you that you are illegally occupying government land. You have 30 days to vacate the premises or face forcible eviction." Francis felt her heart sink, but Benjamin remained calm. "On whose authority?" he asked. Peterson pulled out an official-looking document. "By order of the Territorial Land Office, at the request of concerned citizens who wish to see this land put to productive use." Francis knew without being told that Thomas was behind this new threat. Unable to retrieve her through violence, he was now using legal means to destroy the life she had built. "We'd like to file a homestead claim," Benjamin said steadily. "We've been living here for over a year, have made improvements to the land, and meet all the requirements for legal settlement." Peterson sneered. "I'm afraid it's too late for that, Mr. Scott. This land has already been designated for other purposes, mining purposes, to be specific." So Jeremy had been telling the truth about the silver. Francis felt a surge of anger at the injustice of it all. She and Benjamin had built a life here, had fought and bled for this valley, and now it was to be taken away by men who had never set foot on the land until they smelled profit. 30 days, Peterson repeated. "After that, we'll be back with federal marshals to remove you by force." The officials rode away, leaving Francis and Benjamin to contemplate their options. They could fight, but this time they would be fighting the government itself, not just hired thugs. They could run, but where would they go? Francis was tired of running, tired of being pushed around by men who thought they could take whatever they wanted. "There might be another way," Benjamin said thoughtfully as they discussed their situation that evening. "What do you mean?" "I've been thinking about what Peterson said about mining interests. If this valley really does contain silver, then it's valuable enough to fight for in court, not just with guns." Francis looked at him with confusion. "I don't understand." "We need a lawyer, Francis. Someone who knows territorial law, who can challenge their claim and establish our rights to this land. But that would cost money we don't have, and take time we might not have." Benjamin smiled grimly. "Maybe, but I know someone who might help us. A man I served with during the war, a good man who became a lawyer after he mustered out. If anyone can find a legal way to protect our home, it's him." The next morning, Benjamin set out for the nearest town with telegraph service, leaving Francis alone to guard their valley. She spent the anxious days of his absence preparing for whatever might come, cleaning weapons, checking supplies, and trying not to think about the possibility that their fight might already be lost. Benjamin returned after 5 days with news both good and bad. "I reached my friend," he reported as Francis threw herself into his arms. "His name is Roy Adams, and he's agreed to help us. But Francis, the situation is complicated." They sat by the fire as Benjamin explained what he had learned. The territorial government had indeed received a request to clear the valley for mining, but the request hadn't come from Thomas James directly. Instead, it had come from a mining company that claimed to have purchased the rights to the land from private parties. "The problem is," Benjamin continued, "the company claims they bought the rights from you, Francis. They have documents that supposedly show you sold them your interest in the land for a nominal fee." Francis felt the blood drain from her face. "But I never signed anything. I never even spoke to any mining company." "I know that, and you know that, but the documents look official. Someone went to a lot of trouble to forge your signature and create a paper trail that would stand up in court." "Thomas," Francis whispered. "He must have had the documents forged, then sold the fake rights to the mining company." Benjamin nodded grimly. "That's what Roy thinks too. The good news is that if we can prove the documents are forgeries, we can not only keep our land, but also have Thomas arrested for fraud. And the bad news? The bad news is that proving forgery takes time, and we only have 30 days before the marshals come. Roy is working on getting an injunction to delay the eviction, but he can't guarantee it will work." Francis felt despair creeping over her like a cold fog. Even here, in the wilderness she had come to love, Thomas's malice could reach her. Even after she had found happiness and strength, he was still trying to destroy her life. "I won't let him win," she said suddenly, surprising herself with the vehemence in her voice. "I won't let Thomas James take this away from me. This is my home, Benjamin, our home, and I'll fight for it with everything I have." Benjamin smiled at her with pride and love. "That's my mountain woman," he said. "That's the fighter I married." The weeks that followed were tense and difficult. Roy Adams worked tirelessly to challenge the mining company's claim, while Francis and Benjamin prepared for the possibility that they might have to defend their valley by force once again. The breakthrough came just 3 days before the marshals were due to arrive. Roy sent a telegram announcing that he had found evidence of the forgery. A witness who had seen Thomas James meeting with a known document forger in the territorial capital. More importantly, Roy had discovered that the mining company's own surveys showed that while the valley did contain some silver deposits, they were not nearly as extensive as Jeremy Kelly had claimed. The company had been misled by false geological reports, another part of Thomas's scheme to manipulate them into doing his dirty work. Faced with evidence of fraud and the revelation that they had been deceived about the land's value, the mining company quickly withdrew their claim. The territorial officials, embarrassed by their role in what was clearly a personal vendetta disguised as legitimate business, quietly dropped their eviction order. Thomas James, confronted with evidence of his crimes, agreed to a settlement that would keep him out of prison but cost him dearly in fines and legal fees. More importantly, he was forced to sign a document renouncing any claim to Frances or to any property she might own. "It's over," Benjamin told Francis as he read Roy's final telegram. "Thomas can't touch you anymore. The valley is ours, legally and completely." Francis sank into a chair, hardly able to believe it. After months of fear and uncertainty, after facing down hired killers and corrupt officials, she was finally free. Free to live her life as she chose. Free to love the man who had shown her what she was truly worth. "We did it," she whispered. "We actually did it." "You did it," Benjamin corrected, kneeling beside her chair and taking her hands. "You stood up to them, Francis. You fought for what was yours and you won." Francis looked at her husband, this good man who had seen her value when no one else would, who had stood beside her through every challenge and danger. "We both did it," she said firmly, "together." As autumn painted the mountains in brilliant reds and golds, Francis and Benjamin settled into their new life as the legal owners of their valley. Roy Adams had helped them file all the proper papers, establishing their homestead claim and ensuring that no one could ever again question their right to be there. The victory felt sweet, but even sweeter was the knowledge that they had earned it together, that their love had been tested by fire and emerged stronger than ever. One crisp October morning, as Frances worked in her garden harvesting the last of the season's vegetables, she heard the sound of approaching horses. Her hand instinctively moved to the pistol she now wore at her hip, but these riders were different from the threatening men who had come before. There were 5 of them, and they approached slowly, their hands visible and their manner respectful. The leader was a woman, something Frances had not expected, a handsome lady of perhaps 50 with steel-gray hair and intelligent eyes. "Mrs. Scott," the woman called out as they neared the cabin, "my name is Janet Diaz. I represent the Territorial Women's Association. Might we have a word with you?" Frances straightened, wiping her hands on her apron. Benjamin emerged from the cabin, his rifle in hand but not raised threateningly. "What can we do for you, Mrs. Diaz?" Frances asked. Janet dismounted and approached with a warm smile. "We've come to thank you, Mrs. Scott, and to ask for your help." "Thank me? For what?" "For standing up to Thomas James and his corrupt associates," Janet replied. "Word of your fight has spread throughout the territory. You've become something of a symbol, Mrs. Scott. A symbol of what women can accomplish when they refuse to accept society's limitations." Frances felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I'm not sure I understand." "Let me explain," Janet said. "The Territorial Women's Association is working to secure voting rights for women, to change laws that treat us as property rather than people. Your case, your refusal to be intimidated by powerful men, has inspired women throughout the territory to stand up for themselves. She gestured to her companions. These ladies have traveled from towns across the region to meet you, to learn from your example. Frances looked at the other women, seeing in their faces the same mixture of determination and hope that she had once felt. I'm flattered, she said slowly, but I'm not sure I'm the right person to inspire anyone. I'm just a woman who was tired of being pushed around. Exactly, said one of the other women, a younger lady with bright eyes and calloused hands. That's exactly why you're the right person. You're not some wealthy society woman with nothing to lose. You're one of us, a working woman who fought for her right to live as she chose. Benjamin stepped forward, his expression thoughtful. What exactly are you asking of my wife? Janet turned to him with respect. We're asking her to speak at our territorial convention next month in the capital. To tell her story, to show other women that they don't have to accept whatever fate society tries to force on them. Frances felt a flutter of panic. I'm not a public speaker. I wouldn't know what to say. You'd say what you just said to us, Janet replied gently. That you're a woman who was tired of being pushed around. That you found the strength to fight back, to claim your place in the world. That's a message every woman in the territory needs to hear. Frances looked at Benjamin, seeing encouragement in his eyes. What do you think? She asked him. I think, Benjamin said slowly, that you've already proven you can face down anything life throws at you. A room full of women who admire you should be easy by comparison. Frances considered the request, thinking about the woman she had been when she first arrived in the valley. That woman had been broken, defeated, convinced that her life was over. The woman she was now had fought off armed men, challenged corrupt officials, and won her right to live freely. Maybe it was time to help other women find that same strength. I'll do it, she said finally. I'll speak at your convention. Janet's face lit up with joy. Thank you, Mrs. Scott. You have no idea how much this means to us. As the women prepared to leave, Janet pulled Frances aside for a private word. There's something else, she said quietly. Something you should know about the impact your story has had. What do you mean? 3 women in different towns have left abusive husbands after hearing about your fight. 2 others have started their own businesses despite family opposition. A widow in Silver Creek refused to sell her land to developers who were trying to cheat her, and she won her case in court. Frances felt tears prick her eyes. All because of me? All because you showed them it was possible, Janet corrected. You proved that a woman doesn't have to accept whatever life hands her, that she can fight for something better. After the women left, Frances and Benjamin sat on their porch watching the sun set behind the mountains. Frances felt overwhelmed by the responsibility that had been placed on her shoulders, but also strangely honored. Are you nervous about speaking at the convention? Benjamin asked. Terrified, Frances admitted, but also excited. Benjamin, what if I really can help other women? What if my story can give them the courage to change their lives? Then you'll have done something truly important, Benjamin replied, something that matters far beyond just our little valley. Frances leaned against her husband's shoulder, thinking about the journey that had brought her to this point. A year ago, she had been a discarded wife with no prospects and no hope. Now she was a woman with a voice, someone whose story could inspire others to fight for their own freedom. I never imagined my life could turn out like this, she said softly. What, married to a mountain man in the middle of nowhere? Benjamin teased gently. No, Frances said, smiling. Important, meaningful. I never imagined I could be someone who mattered, someone whose life could make a difference. You've always mattered, Frances. It just took you a while to realize it. The territorial convention was held in early November, in the largest hall in the capital city. Frances had never seen so many women gathered in one place, and the sight was both inspiring and intimidating. She wore her best dress, a simple blue wool that Benjamin had bought for her in town, and carried herself with the quiet confidence she had learned in the mountains. When Janet introduced her to the crowd, the applause was thunderous. Ladies, Frances began, her voice steady despite her nervousness. A year ago, I stood in the same city, a woman with nowhere to go and no one to turn to. I had been cast aside by my husband, rejected by my community, told that I was too old to be of value to anyone. She paused, looking out at the sea of faces, seeing her own past struggles reflected in many of them. I believed them, she continued. I believed I was worthless, that my life was over, that I deserved whatever scraps of existence I could manage to find. The hall was completely silent, every woman hanging on her words. But I was wrong, Frances said, her voice growing stronger. I was wrong about my worth, wrong about my capabilities, wrong about what I deserved from life. It took a good man and a harsh mountain winter to teach me the truth, that every woman has value, that every woman deserves respect, that every woman has the right to fight for her own happiness. She told them about her journey to the mountains, about learning to see herself through Benjamin's eyes, about finding the courage to stand up to men who tried to intimidate and control her. I'm not special, she concluded. I'm not braver or stronger or more capable than any of you. I'm just a woman who got tired of being told she didn't matter. And if I can change my life, if I can claim my place in the world, then so can you. The applause that followed was deafening, but more importantly, Frances could see the impact of her words in the faces of her audience. Women were crying, nodding, whispering to their neighbors, with new determination in their eyes. After the convention, Frances was approached by dozens of women who wanted to share their own stories, to ask for advice, to simply shake the hand of someone who had proven that change was possible. One woman in particular stayed with Frances long after the convention ended. She was young, perhaps 25, with bruises on her arms that her long sleeves couldn't quite hide. Mrs. Scott, she said quietly, my husband beats me. He says it's his right, that I belong to him. But listening to you today, I think maybe I don't have to accept that. Frances took the young woman's hands gently. You don't, she said firmly. No woman has to accept that. You deserve better, and you have the strength to find it. But I don't know how. I don't know where to go or what to do. Frances looked around and saw Janet Diaz nearby. Mrs. Diaz, she called out, could you come here, please? Janet approached, and Frances quickly explained the situation. Within minutes, they had connected the young woman with resources that could help her leave her abusive situation safely. Thank you, the woman whispered to Frances as she prepared to leave with Janet. Thank you for showing me that I don't have to live this way. Frances watched her go with tears in her eyes, remembering her own desperate flight from Cedar Falls and the kindness of strangers who had helped her along the way. The journey back to the mountains felt like a homecoming in the truest sense. Frances had discovered something about herself in the capital, something she had never expected. She had a gift for inspiring others, for helping them see their own worth and potential. You were magnificent, Benjamin told her, as their wagon wound its way up the familiar trails toward home. I've never been prouder of anyone in my life. It felt good, Frances admitted. Scary, but good. To know that my story, my struggles, could help other women find their strength. What will you do now? Janet mentioned that other organizations want you to speak for them. Frances considered the question as she watched the mountains rise around them, welcoming them back to their sanctuary. I think I'd like to do more speaking, yes, but not just about my own story. I want to help other women tell theirs, to find their voices and use them. That sounds like a worthy calling, Benjamin said, and it sounds like something that would make you happy. It would, but Benjamin, this valley will always be my home. Whatever else I do, wherever else I go, I'll always come back to you and to this place that taught me who I really am. Benjamin reached over and took her hand. I'm glad to hear it, because I can't imagine this place without you in it. Winter came early that year, but Frances welcomed it with joy rather than anxiety. This would be their second winter together, and she looked forward to the quiet months when they would have time to plan for the future, to dream about the life they were building together. But even in their remote valley, the outside world continued to intrude. In December, they received a letter from Roy Adams with news that would change everything once again. Thomas James is dead, Benjamin read aloud as they sat by the fire. Killed in a gambling dispute in San Francisco. But Frances, that's not the most important news? Frances looked up from her mending. What do you mean? Roy says that Thomas never actually divorced you legally. The papers he showed you were forgeries. Just like the land documents. In the eyes of the law, you were never divorced at all. Frances felt the world tilt around her. What does that mean? Benjamin continued reading. It means that when Thomas died, his estate passed to his legal wife. You, Frances, you've inherited everything he owned. The business, the house, all of it. Frances set down her sewing with shaking hands. I don't understand. He married Margaret. They had a ceremony. A bigamous ceremony, Benjamin said grimly, which means it was never legal. Margaret has no claim to anything. It all belongs to you. Frances stared into the fire, trying to process this unexpected turn of events. Thomas James, the man who had tried so hard to destroy her, had inadvertently made her wealthy. Roy estimates the estate is worth at least $10,000, Benjamin continued. Maybe more. $10,000. It was more money than Frances had ever dreamed of possessing. With that kind of wealth, she and Benjamin could do anything, go anywhere, live however they chose. What do you want to do? Benjamin asked gently. Frances was quiet for a long time, thinking about the possibilities. She could return to Cedar Falls as a wealthy widow, could make the people who had shunned her pay for their cruelty. She could live in luxury, could travel the world, could have anything money could buy. But as she looked around their small cabin, at the life she and Benjamin had built with their own hands, she realized that she already had everything she truly wanted. I want to use the money to help other women, she said finally. Women like I was. Women who need a second chance. Benjamin smiled. I should have known that would be your answer. What did you have in mind? Frances's eyes brightened as the idea took shape. A home, Benjamin. A place where women who have nowhere else to go can find shelter and support while they rebuild their lives. We could buy land near one of the larger towns, build a proper facility, hire staff to help. It would be a big undertaking, Benjamin warned. You'd have to spend a lot of time away from the mountains, dealing with lawyers and contractors and officials. I know, but Benjamin, think about how many women we could help. Think about how many lives we could change. Benjamin reached over and pulled her into his arms. Then that's what we'll do. We'll build your home for women, and we'll make it the best facility in the territory. You'd really do that? Leave our peaceful life here to take on such a complicated project? Frances, Benjamin said seriously, I fell in love with your strength, your compassion, your determination to make the world better. If building this home is what you want to do, then it's what we'll do together. Frances felt tears of gratitude stream down her cheeks. I love you, Benjamin Scott. I love you for seeing who I really am and supporting my dreams. I love you too, Frances Scott, my mountain woman, my partner, my inspiration. They spent the rest of the winter planning their new venture. Frances wrote letters to women's organizations across the territory, gathering support and advice. Benjamin researched locations and building costs, using his practical knowledge to turn Frances's vision into a workable plan. By spring, they had decided to build the home near Millbrook, the town where Frances had first hired Roy Adams to guide her to the mountains. It was large enough to provide necessary services, but small enough that their facility would make a real difference in the community. The construction took most of the summer, with Frances overseeing every detail, while Benjamin managed the practical aspects of the project. They hired local workers when possible, providing employment for families who needed it while building something that would benefit the entire region. The Frances Scott Home for Women opened its doors in September, exactly 2 years after Frances had first arrived in the mountains. The facility could house 20 women and their children, providing them with safe shelter, job training, and legal assistance as they worked to rebuild their lives. Frances hired a staff of dedicated women to run the day-to-day operations, but she remained closely involved, spending several days each week at the facility while maintaining her home in the valley with Benjamin. The first resident was a young woman named Ashley Cruz, whose husband had abandoned her and their 2 small children when she could no longer work due to illness. She arrived at the home with nothing but the clothes on her back and a desperate hope that someone, somewhere would help her. Mrs. Scott, Ashley said through her tears as Frances welcomed her to the facility, I don't know how to thank you. I was so scared, so lost. I thought my children and I would end up on the streets. Frances embraced the young woman gently. You don't need to thank me, Ashley. You just need to focus on healing and building a new life for yourself and your children. We'll help you every step of the way. Over the following months, the home filled with women from across the territory, widows who had been cheated out of their inheritance, wives who had fled abusive marriages, young women who had been thrown out by their families for various reasons. Each had a different story, but all shared the common experience of being told they were worthless, that they had no options, that they should accept whatever fate society tried to impose on them. Frances worked with each woman individually, helping them discover their own strength and potential. She taught them the lessons she had learned in the mountains, that every woman has value, that age and circumstances don't define worth, that it's never too late to fight for a better life. You remind me of myself when I first came to the mountains, Frances told a 40-year-old widow named Kimberly Wilson, who had been convinced she was too old to start over. I thought my life was over, that I had nothing left to offer the world. But you were young, Kimberly protested. You had time to rebuild. Frances smiled. Kimberly, I was 42 when I left my old life behind. I felt ancient, used up, worthless. But I learned something important. Life doesn't end at 40 or 50 or 60. It changes, but it doesn't end. And sometimes the best chapters come after we think the story's over. Kimberly's eyes filled with hope for the first time since her husband's death. Do you really believe that? I know it, Frances said firmly, because I'm living it. And you can too. The success stories began to multiply. Ashley Cruz learned bookkeeping and found work at a local business, eventually earning enough to rent her own small house for herself and her children. Kimberly Wilson discovered a talent for teaching and was hired by the local school. A teenage girl named Brenda Ward, thrown out by her family for refusing an arranged marriage, learned to read and write and eventually became a teacher herself. Each success validated Frances's belief that every woman deserved a chance to determine her own destiny, regardless of age or circumstances. The home also became a center for women's rights activism in the territory. Frances used her growing influence to lobby for changes in laws that treated women as property, for voting rights, for better working conditions in factories and mines. She spoke at conventions across the region, always returning to the same basic message, that women were not too old, too weak, or too worthless to claim their place in the world. I was once told I was too old to be wanted, she would say to her audiences. Too old to be useful, too old to matter. But I learned something in the mountains that every woman needs to know. We are never too old to fight for our dreams, never too old to demand respect, never too old to change our lives. 3 years after the home opened, Frances received an unexpected visitor. She was working in her office at the facility when her assistant knocked on the door. Mrs. Scott, there's a lady here to see you. She says her name is Margaret Patterson. Frances felt her blood chill. Margaret Patterson had been Margaret James, the young woman Thomas had married in his bigamous ceremony. Frances had not seen or heard from her since the day Thomas had announced his intention to divorce Frances for her. Send her in, Frances said, steeling herself for whatever this encounter might bring. Margaret entered the office hesitantly, and Frances was shocked by the change in her. The confident young woman who had once flaunted her victory over Frances was gone, replaced by someone who looked older than her years, worn down by hardship and disappointment. Mrs. Scott, Margaret said quietly, thank you for seeing me. Frances gestured to a chair. Please sit down. What can I do for you? Margaret sat on the edge of the chair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. I came to apologize, she said, and to ask for your help. Frances raised an eyebrow. My help? When Thomas died, I found out the truth about our marriage, that it was never legal, that you were still his wife in the eyes of the law. I lost everything, Mrs. Scott, the house, the business, even the furniture. I had nowhere to go and no way to support myself. Frances studied the younger woman's face, seeing genuine remorse and desperation there. What happened to you after that? Margaret's voice dropped to a whisper. I tried to find work, but no one would hire me. They all knew I had been living in sin with Thomas, and they treated me like a fallen woman. I ended up doing things I never thought I would do, just to survive. Frances felt a pang of sympathy despite everything Margaret had done to her. And now? Now I'm pregnant, Margaret said, tears streaming down her cheeks. The father doesn't want anything to do with me or the baby. I heard about your home, about how you help women who have nowhere else to turn. I know I have no right to ask after what I did to you, but I'm desperate. Frances was quiet for a long moment, thinking about the young woman's request. Margaret had been instrumental in destroying Frances's first marriage, had gloated over her victory, had shown no compassion for Frances's suffering. But looking at Margaret now, Frances saw not an enemy, but another woman who had been used and discarded by men who saw her only as an object for their pleasure. Margaret had been barely 20 when Thomas seduced her, young enough to be flattered by the attention of an older, established man, naive enough to believe his promises of love and security. Margaret, Frances said gently, do you understand what you did to me? How much pain you caused? Margaret nodded miserably. I was young and stupid and selfish. I thought I was so clever, stealing another woman's husband. I didn't think about what it would do to you. Didn't care about your feelings. I'm sorry, Mrs. Scott. I'm so very sorry. Frances stood and walked to the window, looking out at the mountains in the distance. She thought about the woman she had been when Thomas first brought Margaret home, how devastated she had felt, how worthless and discarded. But she also thought about the woman she had become, about the strength she had found, about the life she had built with Benjamin and the women she had helped through the home. Margaret, she said finally, turning back to face the younger woman, I forgive you. Margaret looked up in shock. You do? I do. Not because what you did was right, but because holding on to anger and resentment would only hurt me. You were a tool Thomas used to hurt me, but you were also a victim of his manipulation. Frances sat back down across from Margaret. Of course you can stay at the home. You'll be treated with the same respect and care as every other resident. We'll help you prepare for your baby's birth, and we'll help you find work so you can support yourself and your child. Margaret broke down completely, sobbing with relief and gratitude. Thank you, she managed through her tears. Thank you for being a better person than I ever was. We all make mistakes, Margaret. The important thing is learning from them and trying to do better. Margaret's stay at the home proved to be transformative for both women. Frances found that helping her former rival taught her even more about the power of forgiveness and compassion. Margaret, meanwhile, blossomed under the care and support she received, becoming one of the most dedicated and helpful residents. When Margaret's son was born, a healthy baby boy she named Thomas in memory of his father, Frances was there to help with the delivery. Holding the tiny infant, Frances felt a profound sense of completion, as if some cosmic circle had been closed. Mrs. Scott, Margaret said as she cradled her newborn son, I want you to know that I'm going to tell him about you when he's old enough to understand. I'm going to tell him about the woman who showed mercy to someone who didn't deserve it, who turned an enemy into a friend. Frances smiled through her tears. Just tell him about the importance of treating all people with respect and kindness, regardless of their age or circumstances. Margaret nodded solemnly. I will, I promise. Margaret eventually found work as a seamstress and moved into her own small apartment, but she remained connected to the home as a volunteer, helping other women who found themselves in desperate situations. The success of the Frances Scott Home for Women led to requests for similar facilities in other parts of the territory. Frances worked with women's organizations and sympathetic politicians to establish a network of homes, each one providing shelter and support for women who needed a second chance. By her 50th birthday, Frances had become one of the most influential women in the territory, known throughout the region for her advocacy work and her commitment to helping others. She had been invited to speak at the territorial capital, had met with governors and senators, had seen laws change because of her efforts, but her greatest joy remained the quiet moments she shared with Benjamin in their mountain valley, the place where she had first learned to see herself as valuable and worthy of love. Do you ever regret it? Benjamin asked one evening as they sat on their porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple. All the traveling, all the speeches, all the time away from home? Frances considered the question, thinking about the hundreds of women she had helped over the years, the lives that had been changed, the laws that had been reformed. "No," she said finally, "I don't regret any of it. But Benjamin, I want you to know that none of it would have been possible without you. You were the first person to see my worth, to believe in my strength. You gave me the foundation I needed to build everything else." Benjamin reached over and took her hand, the gesture as natural and comforting as it had been on their first night together. "You gave me just as much, Frances. You gave me purpose, meaning a reason to be proud of the man I am." Frances squeezed his hand, thinking about the journey that had brought them to this moment. Who would have thought that a discarded wife and a lonely mountain man could build something so meaningful together? "I would have," Benjamin said with a smile. "From the moment you stepped off that mule, determined to prove you were worth something, I knew you were going to change the world." "Our world anyway," Frances said contentedly. "The best kind of world to change," Benjamin agreed. As the years passed, Frances continued her advocacy work while also taking on a new role: mentor to younger women who wanted to follow in her footsteps. She established a scholarship program to help women attend college, created job training programs for women entering the workforce, and worked tirelessly to secure voting rights for women throughout the territory. When the territory achieved statehood and women finally won the right to vote, Frances was invited to cast one of the first ballots in the inaugural election. Standing in the voting booth, she thought about all the women who had fought for this moment, all the women who would benefit from this hard-won right. She also thought about the woman she had been when she first arrived in the mountains: broken, defeated, convinced that her life was over. That woman could never have imagined standing in a voting booth, exercising a right that had been denied to women for generations. The transformation was complete. Frances James Scott was no longer the woman nobody wanted. She was the woman everyone looked to for inspiration, for guidance, for proof that it was never too late to claim your place in the world. On her 60th birthday, Frances received a letter that brought tears to her eyes. It was from Ashley Cruz, the first resident of the Frances Scott Home for Women, now a successful businesswoman with her own bookkeeping firm. "Dear Mrs. Scott," the letter read, "I wanted you to know that I'm naming my new daughter Frances in honor of the woman who saved my life and showed me that I had value. My little Frances will grow up knowing that she can be anything she wants to be, that no one has the right to tell her she's too old, too weak, or too worthless to pursue her dreams. She'll know this because of the example you set, the life you lived, the women you helped. Thank you for showing all of us what it means to be truly strong." Frances shared the letter with Benjamin as they sat by the fire in their mountain cabin, surrounded by the mementos of a life well lived. Photographs of the women they had helped, awards from organizations grateful for their advocacy, letters from politicians whose minds they had changed. 60 years old, Frances mused. When I was 42, I thought my life was ending. Now I feel like it's just beginning. Benjamin, now 56, and still as strong and handsome as the day she met him, smiled at his wife with the same love and admiration he had shown her from the beginning. "What would you like to do for the next chapter?" he asked. Frances looked around their cozy cabin, then out the window at the mountains that had become her sanctuary and her strength. "I think I'd like to write a book," she said. "The story of what we built here, the lessons we've learned, the women we've helped. Maybe it could inspire even more women to fight for their dreams." "I think that's a wonderful idea," Benjamin said. "What will you call it?" Frances thought for a moment, then smiled. "I'll call it Never Too Old, A Mountain Woman's Guide to Finding Your Worth." "Perfect," Benjamin said, pulling her close. "Absolutely perfect." As they sat together in the firelight, Frances reflected on the incredible journey that had brought her to this moment. She had started as a woman nobody wanted, discarded and dismissed by a society that valued youth over wisdom, beauty over character, potential over experience. But she had discovered something that society didn't understand: that a woman's true value had nothing to do with her age, her appearance, or her circumstances. It had to do with her strength, her compassion, her willingness to fight for what she believed in. She had learned that it was never too late to start over, never too late to find love, never too late to make a difference in the world. She had learned that the mountain man who claimed her as his wife had seen something in her that she hadn't even seen in herself, the potential to be extraordinary. "Benjamin," she said softly. "Yes, my love. Thank you for claiming me. Thank you for seeing my worth when I couldn't see it myself. Thank you for showing me that I was never too old to be wanted, to be loved, to be valued." Benjamin kissed the top of her head, breathing in the scent of her hair, still touched with silver but beautiful to him as ever. "Thank you for letting me claim you," he replied. "Thank you for building a life with me, for making me part of something bigger than myself, for showing me what real love looks like." Outside their cabin, the wind whispered through the pines, carrying with it the stories of all the women who had found strength in Frances's example, all the lives that had been changed by her courage, all the dreams that had been realized because she had refused to accept society's limitations. Frances James Scott, the woman nobody wanted, had become the woman everyone needed. She had proven that age was just a number, that worth was not determined by others' opinions, that it was never too late to fight for the life you deserved. And in the quiet of their mountain home, surrounded by the love of the man who had first seen her value and the legacy of the women she had helped, Frances knew that her life had been everything she had never dared to dream it could be. The mountain man had claimed her, but in the end, she had claimed herself, and that, she knew, was the most important victory of all. As the fire burned low and the mountains settled into their ancient silence, Frances James Scott smiled with the deep contentment of a woman who had found her place in the world, who had learned her worth, who had discovered that she was never, ever too old to be exactly who she was meant to be. The story that had begun with rejection and despair had become a tale of triumph and transformation, proof that every woman, regardless of age or circumstances, possessed the strength to write her own ending. And Frances's ending, she knew, was really just another beginning.